Montana Territory, 1885. The letter that changed everything arrived on a Tuesday, carried by a dust-covered courier who looked as out of place among the windswept prairie as a pearl on a pig. Thomas Yates stood on his front porch, squinting in the harsh sunlight as he accepted the envelope with calloused hands that hadn't known a woman's touch in what felt like a lifetime. But it hadn't been a lifetime, just 15 years. The 24-year-old rancher stared at the envelope, confusion etching his sun-bronzed face. Mail was rare out here, 30 miles from the nearest town of Clearwater Springs. He broke the seal, unfolded the paper, and felt his heart skip. Arriving May 16th on the afternoon train. Yours faithfully, Rebecca Kincaid. Thomas read the brief note 3 times, running a hand through his thick chestnut hair. He had no idea who Rebecca Kincaid was, and he certainly hadn't sent for anyone to arrive on any train. But one thing was abundantly clear. Today was May 16th, and the afternoon train would be pulling into Clearwater Springs in less than 2 hours. Thomas Yates had built his ranch from nothing after inheriting the land from his uncle at the tender age of 9. Orphaned by a cholera epidemic that swept through Colorado when he was 8, Thomas had been sent to live with his only relative, Uncle Jeb, an aging bachelor who worked this remote Montana property with grim determination. Just a year later, Jeb was thrown from his horse while chasing down stray cattle during a thunderstorm. The boy had found him the next morning, still and cold in the muddy grass. That had been 15 years ago. 15 years of solitude broken only by occasional supply runs to town and the rare visitor, usually a lost traveler or someone looking to buy cattle. 15 years of falling asleep to the lonesome howl of wolves and waking to the sound of his own breathing. 15 years without the soft touch of a woman or the comfort of family. Thomas had grown into his tall frame nicely. 6 feet of lean muscle earned through hard ranch work, with eyes the color of a summer storm, gray with hints of blue that changed with his mood. Despite living alone, he maintained himself well, shaving regularly, keeping his thick brown hair trimmed just above his collar. Not out of vanity, but discipline. His uncle had taught him that much before passing. A man who lets himself go has already given up. The letter trembled in his hand as he contemplated what to do. The most logical explanation was that this Rebecca Kincaid had mistaken him for someone else. Perhaps there was another Thomas in the territory, one who'd sent for a mail-order bride. The thought brought a wry smile to his lips. He couldn't deny the brief flutter of curiosity. Who was this woman so confident in her correspondence, so certain she'd be welcomed? Thomas whistled for his horse, a handsome buckskin gelding named Scout. There was only one way to solve this mystery. He'd have to ride to town and explain the mistake to Miss Kincaid personally, then help her locate the correct Thomas, whoever he might be. The ride to Clearwater Springs took just over an hour at a steady pace. As Thomas approached, he could see the train's black smoke on the horizon, a dark smudge against the bright blue sky. His stomach tightened with an unfamiliar anxiety. What would he say to her? How would she react to learning her journey had been in vain? Thomas tied Scout outside the general store and made his way to the small train platform just as the locomotive came to a hissing, steaming stop. A handful of passengers disembarked, a well-dressed businessman, an elderly couple, and a young woman carrying a modest carpet bag. The moment he saw her, Thomas felt as though he'd been kicked in the chest by a particularly ornery mule. Rebecca Kincaid stood on the platform looking uncertainly around her, the late afternoon sun catching in her hair, a rich auburn that fell in loose waves to the middle of her back. She wore a practical traveling dress of forest green, its high collar and simple cut doing nothing to hide the graceful curve of her neck or the slender silhouette of her figure. But it was her eyes that captured him completely, large and expressive, the warm amber of maple syrup in sunlight, with flecks of gold that seemed to dance when she blinked. She couldn't have been more than 20, with a sprinkle of freckles across the bridge of her nose that gave her a youthful, innocent appearance despite the determined set of her jaw. Thomas removed his hat and approached her, his throat suddenly dry. Miss Kincaid. She turned to him, and those remarkable eyes widened. Mr. Yates? A smile bloomed on her face, transforming her from pretty to breathtaking. Oh, thank goodness. I was afraid you might not come. Thomas opened his mouth to explain the mistake, but found himself saying instead, Welcome to Clearwater Springs. Rebecca's smile faltered slightly as she studied his face. You're younger than I expected, and you're far prettier than I had any right to hope. The words slipped out before he could stop them. A blush crept up his neck as he realized what he'd said. I mean, there seems to be a misunderstanding, Miss Kincaid. The station master called out behind them. All aboard. The train would only stop briefly before continuing its journey west. Rebecca's face paled. A misunderstanding? Thomas looked at the departing train, then back at the young woman. He couldn't just leave her stranded in a strange town as the sun began to set. Whatever the confusion, it would have to wait until morning. Nothing that can't be sorted out, he assured her quickly. Let me take your bag. We should get some supper, and I can explain. Relief flooded her features. I've been traveling for days. A meal sounds wonderful. As they walked toward the town's only restaurant, Thomas felt the stares of Clearwater Springs residents. It had been years since he'd been seen in the company of a woman, let alone one as striking as Rebecca Kincaid. The restaurant was simple but clean, with checkered cloths on the tables and the aroma of beef stew filling the air. After they were seated and had ordered, Thomas finally gathered his courage. Miss Kincaid, I'm afraid there's been a mistake. I never sent for a mail-order bride. Rebecca froze, the glass of water halfway to her lips. You didn't? No, ma'am. I received your letter just today, but I haven't written to any marriage agencies. Her cheeks flushed a deep crimson as she carefully set down her glass. I see. She straightened her shoulders, composing herself. Well, this is mortifying. I'm truly sorry, Thomas said, feeling wretched at the pain in her eyes. There must be another Thomas in these parts. Rebecca's hand trembled slightly as she reached into her reticule and withdrew a folded paper. The agency gave me this address. Raven Creek Ranch, Clearwater Springs, Montana Territory. Thomas felt a chill run through him. That's my ranch. Their eyes met across the table, confusion mirrored in both faces. How is that possible? She whispered. Before Thomas could respond, the waitress arrived with their meals. As she set down the plates, she beamed at Thomas. So nice to see you in town with company, Mr. Yates. Your pa would be so proud to see you finally settling down. Thomas nearly choked. Mrs. Bennett, Miss Kincaid is just... Oh, honey, no need to be shy. The whole town's been wondering when you'd find yourself a bride. 15 years is a long time to run that big ranch all alone. She patted Rebecca's hand. You got yourself a good one, dear. Handsome as the day is long and owns the finest cattle operation in 3 counties. Mrs. Bennett bustled away before either could correct her, leaving an awkward silence in her wake. Rebecca picked at her food, clearly unsettled. 15 years? But you can't be more than 25. Thomas sighed. I'm 24. My uncle died when I was 9, leaving me the ranch. I've been running it ever since. Rebecca's amber eyes widened. Alone? Since you were 9 years old. There were neighbors who helped at first. I learned quickly. He shrugged, uncomfortable with her amazement. It's just been me for a long while now. That's... She seemed at a loss for words. What about you? Thomas asked, eager to shift the focus. How does a young woman like yourself end up on a train to Montana to marry a stranger? A shadow crossed Rebecca's face, and she glanced down at her plate. My father died last year. Our farm in Pennsylvania failed, and the bank took everything. Her voice grew softer. I have no other family. The marriage agency seemed like a chance for a new beginning. Thomas felt a knot form in his stomach. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. It was potentially devastating for the young woman sitting across from him. Do you have money to return east? He asked gently. Rebecca's silence was answer enough. We'll figure something out, Thomas promised, though he had no idea what. As they finished their meal, a jovial voice boomed across the restaurant. Thomas Yates, you old hermit. What brings you to town on a weekday? A large man with a silver mustache approached their table, his eyes widening at the sight of Rebecca. Well now, who's this lovely lady? Thomas stood to shake the man's hand. Sheriff Davis, this is Miss Rebecca Kincaid. Miss Kincaid, Sheriff Elijah Davis. The sheriff tipped his hat. Ma'am, it's a pleasure. Though I must say, you've accomplished what none of us thought possible, getting this young man to socialize. Rebecca managed a polite smile. We've only just met, Sheriff. Sheriff Davis looked between them, confusion evident. Oh, I assumed you were. That is my apologies. Thomas cleared his throat. Miss Kincaid arrived on today's train. There's been some confusion about her destination. The sheriff's eyebrows rose. Is that so? Well, it's getting late. Where will the lady be staying tonight? The question hung in the air like a gunshot. Thomas hadn't thought that far ahead. Clearwater Springs had no hotel, only a saloon with rooms upstairs that no respectable woman would enter. Thomas began, uncertain. Rebecca spoke up, her voice surprisingly firm. Mr. Yates has kindly offered to let me stay at his ranch until we sort things out. Isn't that right? Thomas met her gaze, reading the desperation behind her confident facade. She had nowhere else to go, and they both knew it. That's right, he confirmed. Just until we can clarify this misunderstanding. Sheriff Davis looked skeptical. Well now, that wouldn't be proper without a chaperone. Mrs. Bennet could accompany us, Rebecca suggested quickly. I'm sure she wouldn't mind a brief visit to the country. The older woman, overhearing her name, hurried over. I'd be delighted, dear. My daughter can watch the restaurant. It's been years since I've seen Raven Creek Ranch. The sheriff seemed satisfied with this arrangement, though his eyes still held questions as he bid them good night. Thomas felt a mixture of relief and trepidation. He was bringing a young woman to his home, a home that hadn't seen a female presence since he was a child. As they stepped out into the cooling evening air, Rebecca whispered, "Thank you. I had nowhere else to go." Thomas nodded, unable to formulate a response that wouldn't reveal how completely out of his depth he felt. In the fading light, with her hair glowing like embers in the sunset, Rebecca Kincaid looked like a vision from a dream he'd never dared to have. What had he gotten himself into? The ride back to Raven Creek Ranch was filled with Mrs. Bennet's continuous chatter, leaving Thomas grateful for the buffer between himself and Rebecca. He'd borrowed a wagon for the journey, not wanting either woman to have to ride horseback in their dresses. As they crested the final hill, Raven Creek Ranch spread out below them in the moonlight. A sprawling property with a sturdy two-story farmhouse, several outbuildings, and pastures dotted with the dark shapes of cattle. "Oh my," Rebecca breathed, taking in the view. "It's beautiful." Thomas saw his home through her eyes for a moment. The solid house with its wide porch and chimney puffing smoke against the starry sky. The well-kept barns and corrals, the fields stretching to the creek that gave the ranch its name. "It's home," he said simply. Mrs. Bennet patted Rebecca's hand. "Thomas has built this place into something special. His uncle left it in shambles, poor man barely keeping it together before he passed. But this boy," she nodded toward Thomas, "he had a vision. Worked himself nearly to death making it what it is now." Rebecca's gaze shifted to Thomas, something like admiration in her eyes. He focused on the road ahead, uncomfortable with the praise. The house itself was surprisingly well kept for a bachelor's residence. The main floor consisted of a spacious kitchen with a large wood-burning stove, a dining room with a sturdy oak table that could seat 8, and a cozy sitting room with bookshelves lining one wall. Upstairs were 3 bedrooms and a small study. "This was my uncle's room," Thomas said, showing Rebecca to the largest bedroom. "The linens are clean. I change them every month, force of habit." He didn't add that he'd done it to preserve the illusion that someone might visit someday. Rebecca stood in the doorway, taking in the simple but comfortable furnishings, a large bed with a handmade quilt, a dresser with a mirror, a rocking chair by the window. "Thank you," she said softly. "It's lovely." Mrs. Bennet took the room across the hall, leaving Thomas to his usual quarters at the end of the corridor. As he prepared for bed, Thomas heard the women's quiet voices, then the gentle closing of doors as they retired. Lying in his bed, staring at the familiar patterns of moonlight on his ceiling, Thomas couldn't remember the last time his house had felt so alive. The knowledge that others were breathing under his roof, that he wasn't completely alone for the first time in years, was both comforting and unsettling. Morning came with the crow of his rooster and the smell of coffee brewing, something Thomas hadn't experienced since he was a child. He dressed quickly and made his way downstairs to find Mrs. Bennet bustling around his kitchen as if she owned it, and Rebecca setting the table for breakfast. She looked up as he entered, a shy smile lighting her face. She'd changed into a simple blue dress that brought out the gold flecks in her eyes, and her hair was braided neatly down her back. "Good morning, Mr. Yates. I hope you don't mind us making ourselves useful." "Not at all," he managed, suddenly conscious of his rough appearance. He'd shaved and put on a clean shirt, but he felt unpolished compared to her fresh-faced beauty. Breakfast was a revelation: fluffy scrambled eggs, bacon, and biscuits that put his usual hardtack to shame. "This is delicious," he said, realizing he'd forgotten how wonderful a home-cooked meal could be. "Rebecca did most of it," Mrs. Bennet said with a wink. "The girl has talent in the kitchen." Rebecca blushed. My mother taught me. She always said a good meal brings harmony to a household. After breakfast, Mrs. Bennet announced she needed to return to town. My daughter will be worried if I'm gone too long. This presented a new dilemma. Thomas couldn't leave Rebecca alone. It would ruin her reputation, but he couldn't send her back to town with nowhere to stay. I was thinking, Rebecca said hesitantly. Perhaps I could remain here for a short time. As your housekeeper, she added quickly. Just until I earn enough for a ticket back east. Thomas blinked in surprise. A housekeeper? Yes. You've been alone for 15 years. Surely you could use some help with cooking and cleaning. Her chin lifted slightly. I'm a hard worker, Mr. Yates. I won't be a burden. Mrs. Bennet clapped her hands. What a sensible arrangement. I'll spread the word in town so no one gets the wrong idea. Thomas Yates, responsible rancher, hiring help for his bachelor establishment. Perfectly respectable. Thomas looked from one woman to the other, feeling oddly outnumbered. I suppose, if you're certain, Miss Kincaid. I am, she said firmly. And please, call me Rebecca. After Mrs. Bennet departed, an awkward silence fell between them. Thomas rarely spent time in the house during daylight hours, and having Rebecca there disrupted his routine in ways he hadn't anticipated. I should show you around the property, he said finally. If you're going to stay, you should know your way about. Rebecca nodded eagerly. I'd like that very much. The tour took most of the morning. Thomas showed her the barn with its stalls for horses and storage for feed, the chicken coop where a dozen hens supplied eggs, the smokehouse where he cured meat, and the vegetata garden that had gone somewhat wild in recent years. This could be magnificent with a bit of attention, Rebecca said, examining the tangled tomato vines and overgrown bean plants. I don't have much time for gardening, Thomas admitted. The cattle and horses take priority. Rebecca knelt and pulled a weed. I could restore it. I've always had a knack for growing things. Thomas watched her working, her slender fingers deftly separating weeds from vegetable plants, and felt something unfamiliar stirring in his chest. A longing he'd suppressed for so long, he'd almost forgotten it existed. There's something we need to discuss, he said abruptly. The matter of who sent for you. Rebecca's hand stilled. Yes, I've been wondering about that myself. Someone used my name and address. Thomas frowned. That concerns me. Rebecca stood, brushing dirt from her skirt. Could it have been a neighbor playing a joke? Thomas shook his head. I don't have close neighbors, and anyone who knows me wouldn't find this amusing. What about enemies? She asked quietly. Have you crossed anyone who might want to embarrass you? The question gave Thomas pause. There was one possibility, but he hesitated to voice it. There's a man named Victor Ryland. Owns the next property over. He's been trying to buy my land for years. Makes an offer every spring like clockwork. Why does he want your ranch? Water rights. Raven Creek is the most reliable water source in the area. His cattle suffer in dry years. Thomas shrugged. But sending a mail-order bride as some kind of trick? That seems extreme, even for him. Rebecca considered this. Perhaps I should write to the agency. Ask who arranged for me to come here. That's a good idea. We can send the letter with tomorrow's mail coach. Thomas hesitated. In the meantime, what should we tell people? About why you're here. A flush crept up Rebecca's neck. Mrs. Bennet's explanation seems sensible. That I'm your housekeeper. And when people ask why I suddenly need help after 15 years alone, Rebecca met his gaze steadily. Tell them the truth. That you're expanding your operation and need someone to manage the household while you focus on the ranch. Thomas nodded slowly. It was a reasonable explanation, one that preserved her dignity and his privacy. Agreed. That evening, Rebecca prepared a stew that filled the house with aromas Thomas had almost forgotten. Onions, carrots, and beef melding together with herbs he didn't even know he had in his pantry. They ate at the kitchen table by lamplight, the domesticity of the scene both foreign and strangely comforting. May I ask you something? Rebecca said as they finished their meal. Of course. Why have you stayed alone all these years? A man like you could have found a wife in town, started a family. Thomas considered her question, surprised by his willingness to answer honestly. After my uncle died, all I could think about was proving I could run this place. Then it became a habit, I suppose. Being alone. Were you never lonely? Sometimes, he admitted. Especially in winter, when the snow makes it impossible to reach town for weeks. Rebecca's eyes held a depth of understanding that made him feel exposed. I know something about loneliness. After my mother died when I was 14, my father retreated into himself. We lived in the same house, but existed in separate worlds. I'm sorry, Thomas said, meaning it. That sounds harder than being physically alone. Perhaps, she agreed softly. But now I understand why I felt drawn to come west, despite my fears. Sometimes loneliness calls to loneliness. Their eyes met across the table, and Thomas felt a connection that transcended their brief acquaintance, a recognition of shared solitude that needed no further explanation. The moment was broken by a knock at the door, sharp and insistent. Thomas frowned. Visitors were rare, especially after nightfall. When he opened the door, Sheriff Davis stood on his porch, hat in hand. "Evening, Thomas. Sorry to disturb you." "Sheriff, is something wrong?" Davis glanced past him, his eyes widening slightly at the sight of Rebecca clearing the dinner table. "I just wanted to check that everything was in order here." Thomas sighed. "As Mrs. Bennet no doubt told you, Miss Kincaid has agreed to serve as my housekeeper temporarily." The sheriff nodded. "Yes, that's what she said. It's an unusual arrangement, Thomas. These are unusual circumstances. Miss Kincaid needs employment, and I could use help around the place." Davis didn't look convinced. "Just be careful. People talk, even way out here." After the sheriff departed, Thomas closed the door with more force than necessary. "I apologize for that. I'm not accustomed to defending my household decisions." Rebecca had finished washing the dishes and was drying her hands on a towel. "He's just doing his job, making sure I'm safe." "Are you?" Thomas asked suddenly. "Safe, I mean. Here with me. A man you barely know, miles from town." A small smile curved her lips. "Strangely, yes. I feel safer here than I have in a long time." That night, as Thomas lay awake listening to the unfamiliar creaks of someone else moving about his house, he wondered what Rebecca had run from back east. There was a wariness in her eyes sometimes, a guardedness that spoke of experiences beyond losing her father and home. And why did she trust him, a stranger, so readily? The question nagged at him until sleep finally claimed him, bringing dreams of auburn hair gleaming in sunlight and amber eyes that held secrets he longed to uncover. The next morning, Thomas woke to find Rebecca already in the kitchen, kneading dough for bread. Flour dusted her cheeks, and a strand of hair had escaped her braid, curling against her neck. He paused in the doorway, struck by the domesticity of the scene and how right she looked in his kitchen. "Good morning," she said, looking up with a smile that made his heart skip. "I hope I didn't wake you." "No, I'm usually up with the sun." He poured himself coffee from the pot she'd prepared. "You don't need to work so hard. There's no rush to earn your way." Rebecca's hands continued their rhythmic kneading. "I enjoy being useful, and I sleep better when I'm tired." Thomas understood that better than she knew. Hard work had been his salvation after his uncle died, exhaustion his only defense against grief and fear. "I need to ride out to check the north pasture today," he said. "The cattle should be moved to fresh grazing." Rebecca nodded. "Will you be gone all day?" "Most of it." "Will you be all right here alone?" "I'll be fine. I thought I might tackle that garden in earnest." She glanced at him. "Unless you'd rather I didn't." "No, please. Do whatever you like with it. My mother had a garden there, long ago. She'd be pleased to see it thriving again." Rebecca's expression softened. "You lost your parents young?" "I was 8. Cholera took them both within days of each other." Thomas rarely spoke of this, but something about Rebecca made the words come easier. "They sent me to live with my uncle here. He wasn't much for farming, preferred cattle, so the garden went to seed." "I'm sorry," she said, her flour-covered hands stilling. "That must have been terribly hard for a child." Thomas shrugged. "Life is hard. You survive." "Yes," she agreed, a shadow crossing her face. "You survive." Something in her tone made him wonder again what hardships she'd endured. Before he could ask, she brightened visibly. "I wrote that letter to the marriage agency. If you could post it when you're in town next." "I'll take it today. I need to pick up supplies anyway." As Thomas prepared to leave, Rebecca handed him a parcel wrapped in cloth. "I made sandwiches. For your ride." The simple gesture caught him off guard. "Thank you. That's very thoughtful." She smiled, and for a moment, Thomas was tempted to invite her along, to share the beauty of his land with her. But the impropriety of such an outing, just the two of them, stopped the words in his throat. Instead, he tipped his hat and mounted Scout, the lunch parcel secured in his saddlebag. As he rode away, he couldn't resist looking back. Rebecca stood on the porch, one hand shading her eyes as she watched him go, her skirts billowing in the morning breeze. The image stayed with him throughout the day as he moved cattle, mended a broken fence, and finally made his way to town for supplies. At the general store, he handed Rebecca's letter to Mr. Wilson, the postmaster, who raised his eyebrows knowingly. "Heard you got yourself some help out at the ranch," Wilson said, weighing the letter. "Mrs. Bennet says she's a real looker." Thomas kept his expression neutral. "Miss Kincaid is my housekeeper. Nothing more." Wilson chuckled. "If you say so, Thomas. Though I can't imagine why a pretty young thing like that would want to bury herself out at Raven Creek with only you for company. She needed work. I needed help." Thomas gathered his purchases. "It's a simple arrangement." "Simple, huh?" Wilson's eyes twinkled mischievously. "Tell that to Victor Ryland. Man nearly turned purple when he heard you had a young lady staying at your place. Came in here ranting about how you think you're too good for local girls. Had to send all the way back east." Thomas frowned. "Ryland said that? When?" "Yesterday afternoon. Seemed mighty interested in your new housekeeper." Wilson made air quotes with his fingers. The information troubled Thomas. Victor Ryland's interest confirmed his suspicion that the man might have been involved in Rebecca's arrival. But why? What could he possibly gain from such a scheme? As Thomas rode home, his mind churned with possibilities, each more unlikely than the last. Was Ryland hoping to create a scandal? To distract Thomas from ranch business? To lure him into town more often so he could snoop around the property? None of it made sense, especially considering Rebecca herself seemed genuinely confused by the mix-up. When he arrived home, the sight that greeted him drove all thoughts of Victor Ryland from his mind. Rebecca had transformed the overgrown garden. Neat rows of vegetable plants stood tended and watered, weeds piled to one side for composting. She'd even created a small border of wildflowers she must have transplanted from the nearby meadow. She looked up as he approached, her face flushed from exertion, a smudge of dirt across one cheek. "What do you think?" "It's amazing," he said honestly. "I can't believe you did all this in one day." Rebecca beamed. "I've always found gardening therapeutic, and your soil is remarkably rich." Thomas dismounted, leading Scout toward the barn. "Let me take care of my horse, and I'll help you finish." "No need," she said, rising to her feet. "I'm done for today, and you must be exhausted." Their evening fell into a pattern that felt surprisingly comfortable. Rebecca preparing a simple but delicious meal while Thomas recounted his day's work. After supper, they sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the Montana sky in vibrant oranges and purples. "I met a man today who might know something about your arrival here," Thomas said, breaking their companionable silence. Rebecca turned to him, curiosity in her eyes. "Oh, Victor Ryland, the neighbor I mentioned who wants my land." Thomas explained what Mr. Wilson had told him about Ryland's reaction. "It seems suspicious. You think he somehow arranged for me to come here? Why would he do that?" Thomas shook his head. "I don't know, but he's been after Raven Creek for years. He's not above underhanded tactics." Rebecca considered this, her brow furrowed. "If he did arrange it, what was he hoping would happen? That I would cause problems for you somehow? Or that taking in a single woman would damage my reputation?" Thomas sighed. "Though that seems a long way to go just to discredit me." "Perhaps." Rebecca hesitated. "Perhaps he hoped I would convince you to sell. That having a woman around might make you reconsider your solitary life here." The thought hadn't occurred to Thomas. Could Ryland have hoped that a female presence would soften his resolve? Make him yearn for a different life in town? If so, the plan had backfired spectacularly. Having Rebecca at Raven Creek didn't make Thomas want to leave. It made the ranch feel more like home than it had in years. Whatever his reason, Thomas said finally, "I'm glad you're here, Rebecca, even if it was a mistake." In the fading light, he could see her smile, soft and genuine. "So am I." As days turned into weeks, they settled into a rhythm that felt as natural as breathing. Rebecca brought order and warmth to the house, cooking meals that reminded Thomas of his mother's cooking, keeping the rooms clean and bright with wildflowers in jars on the tables. She expanded the garden, planted herbs near the kitchen door, and even set up a small table on the porch where they often ate supper, watching the sunset. Thomas found himself looking forward to returning home each evening in a way he never had before. The sight of smoke rising from the chimney, the knowledge that someone waited for him inside, filled a void he'd hardly acknowledged existed. June arrived with warm days and mild nights, Perfect weather for the county's annual summer dance in town. Thomas hadn't attended in years, having no reason to participate in such social events. But when Rebecca mentioned it over breakfast one morning, he found himself offering to take her. Really? Her eyes lit up. You wouldn't mind? Not at all, he said, surprised to find he meant it. You've been working hard. You deserve some entertainment. The day of the dance, Thomas finished his chores early and took extra care with his appearance, bathing in the creek and putting on his one good shirt, white cotton, rarely worn, and his least worn pair of denims. He even polished his boots, something he hadn't bothered with in years. When Rebecca descended the stairs, Thomas forgot to breathe for a moment. She wore a dress he hadn't seen before, a lovely pale blue that complemented her auburn hair, which she'd styled in an elegant twist with a few curls framing her face. The dress wasn't new or particularly fancy, likely one she'd brought with her from Pennsylvania, but on her, it looked like the finest gown. You look beautiful, he said simply. A blush colored her cheeks. Thank you. You look quite handsome yourself. The drive to town was filled with a pleasant anticipation. Thomas realized he was looking forward to introducing Rebecca to the community, no longer as his mysterious housekeeper, but as, what, exactly? The question troubled him as they approached the town hall, where lanterns illuminated the gathering crowd. Inside, a small band played lively tunes while couples danced and others chatted around tables laden with food and drink. Their entrance caused a stir, conversations pausing as heads turned to observe them. Mrs. Bennet rushed over immediately. Thomas Yates, I never thought I'd see the day. And Rebecca, dear, you look absolutely charming. Others soon joined them, curious townsfolk eager to meet the young woman who had apparently drawn the reclusive rancher out of his shell. Thomas introduced Rebecca proudly, watching as she charmed everyone with her genuine smile and kind attention. She's quite something, Sheriff Davis commented, appearing at Thomas's side as Rebecca chatted with a group of women. Seems to have brought you back to life. Thomas couldn't deny it. She has a way about her. Still just your housekeeper? The sheriff's tone was knowing. Before Thomas could respond, a commotion at the entrance drew their attention. Victor Ryland had arrived, his imposing figure filling the doorway. In his 50s, with silver streaking his dark hair and a meticulously groomed mustache, Ryland exuded the confidence of a man accustomed to getting his way. His eyes scanned the room until they found Thomas, then shifted to Rebecca. A smile that didn't reach his eyes spread across his face as he made his way toward them. Thomas Yates, he boomed, extending his hand. What a pleasant surprise. You usually avoid these gatherings like the plague. Thomas shook his hand briefly. Ryland, and this must be the young lady I've heard so much about. Ryland turned to Rebecca, taking her hand and bowing slightly. Victor Ryland, owner of Bridgewater Ranch. Your reputation precedes you, Miss Kincaid. Rebecca withdrew her hand politely but quickly. I wasn't aware I had a reputation, Mr. Ryland. Oh, indeed. The mysterious Eastern beauty who's managed to domesticate our wild hermit. His laugh was too loud, his gaze too intent. I must say, I'm impressed. I've been trying to convince young Thomas here to join civilization for years. Thomas felt a surge of protectiveness. Rebecca is my housekeeper, Ryland. Nothing more. Of course, of course. Ryland winked conspiratorially. Though I can't imagine why a lovely young woman would choose to live so remotely unless there were other considerations. The insinuation hung in the air, unmistakable. Rebecca's cheeks flushed, but her voice remained steady. Mr. Yates has been a perfect gentleman. He offered me employment when I found myself in difficult circumstances. How fortunate for you both. Ryland's smile didn't waver. Perhaps you might persuade him to consider my offer for his land. A young woman like yourself deserves town life, not isolation on a remote ranch. Thomas stepped forward. That's enough, Ryland. My land isn't for sale. It never will be. Ryland's expression hardened momentarily before he recovered his jovial facade. Never is a long time, Thomas. Circumstances change. People change. His eyes flickered to Rebecca. You might find your priorities shifting. With a slight bow, he moved away, leaving an uncomfortable tension in his wake. I apologize for him, Thomas said quietly. He's been after my land for years. Rebecca's eyes followed Ryland across the room. There's something unsettling about him, almost as if he knows something we don't. The band struck up a waltz, and couples moved to the dance floor. Thomas hesitated, then offered his hand to Rebecca. Would you care to dance? Surprise and pleasure lit her face. I'd love to. Though I should warn you, it's been a while. For me as well, he admitted, leading her to the floor. My mother taught me when I was very young. As they joined the other dancers, Thomas placed one hand at Rebecca's waist, taking her right hand in his left. The contact, though proper and expected for the dance, sent a jolt through him. They began to move, a bit awkwardly at first, then with increasing confidence as they found their rhythm together. You're quite good at this, Rebecca said, looking up at him with a smile that made his heart race. So are you, he returned, guiding her through a turn. The scent of wildflowers clung to her hair, and the feeling of her in his arms seemed both new and familiar, as if they'd done this 100 times before. As they danced, Thomas became aware of the stares and whispers around them. The entire town was watching, making their own conclusions about the nature of his relationship with Rebecca. For once, he found he didn't care what they thought. When the music ended, they remained standing close together, reluctant to break the spell that had enveloped them. Thomas, she said softly, using his first name for the first time. May I cut in? Victor Ryland appeared beside them, his hand already reaching for Rebecca's. Before Thomas could object, social convention forced him to step back, allowing Ryland to take his place as the next song began. He watched, tension building in his chest, as Ryland pulled Rebecca closer than was strictly necessary, leaning down to speak in her ear. Whatever Ryland said made Rebecca stiffen, her smile fading. Thomas moved to the edge of the dance floor, keeping them in sight, his protective instincts on high alert. When the dance ended, Rebecca quickly excused herself from Ryland's company and made her way to Thomas's side, her face pale. What did he say to you? Thomas asked, concern evident in his voice. Rebecca glanced around to ensure they weren't overheard. He knows about the mail-order bride arrangement. He said he found it fascinating that I arrived expecting marriage but settled for being your housekeeper instead. Thomas's jaw tightened. That confirms it. He must have been involved somehow. There's more, Rebecca continued, her voice low. He said he'd be happy to offer me alternative arrangements if I ever tired of ranch life. That a woman like me deserves better than to be a glorified servant. Anger surged through Thomas. The nerve of that man. I told him I was perfectly content with my current situation, Rebecca assured him. But Thomas, the way he spoke, as if he knew exactly why I came here, it was unsettling. Thomas took her hand. Would you like to leave? She nodded, relief evident in her eyes. As they made their excuses and departed, Thomas could feel Ryland watching them, a calculating smile on his face. The ride home was quiet, both lost in their own thoughts about the evening's revelations. When they reached the ranch, Thomas helped Rebecca down from the wagon, his hands lingering at her waist a moment longer than necessary. In the moonlight, with her hair coming loose from its elegant arrangement, she looked ethereal. Thank you for taking me tonight, she said. Despite Mr. Ryland, I had a wonderful time. So did I, Thomas admitted. It's been a long time since I've enjoyed a social gathering. They stood close together in the yard, the night air cool around them, filled with the scent of pine and wildflowers. Thomas found himself drawn to her, the distance between them closing by inches. Rebecca looked up at him, her eyes reflecting the starlight. Thomas, she whispered, her voice barely audible. He leaned down, his heart hammering in his chest, and gently pressed his lips to hers. The kiss was brief, tentative, a question more than a declaration. When he pulled back, the wonder in her eyes mirrored his own feelings. I should. She gestured vaguely toward the house. Yes. Thomas agreed, though he made no move to step away. Rebecca reached up to touch his cheek, a gentle caress that felt like a promise. Good night, Thomas. As she disappeared into the house, Thomas remained in the yard, looking up at the vast Montana sky. Something fundamental had shifted between them tonight, something that couldn't be undone or ignored. And somewhere in the back of his mind, a warning bell sounded. Victor Ryland knew too much about Rebecca's arrival. Whatever game he was playing, Thomas sensed they were approaching its climax. The thought filled him with dread, not for himself, but for the woman who had somehow become essential to his happiness in the span of a few short weeks. The morning after the dance, Thomas found a letter in his mailbox when he rode out to check the property boundaries, an unusual occurrence since mail was typically collected in town. The envelope bore no stamp, suggesting it had been delivered personally. Inside was a brief note in an unfamiliar hand. If you value Miss Kincaid's reputation, meet me at Clearwater Saloon, tomorrow, noon. Come alone. Vr. Thomas crumpled the note in his fist, anger coursing through him. Whatever Ryland was planning, it clearly involved Rebecca. The threat to her reputation was thinly veiled but unmistakable. When he returned to the house, Rebecca was hanging laundry in the yard, humming softly to herself. The sight of her going about this domestic task with such contentment made his chest ache. How could he tell her about Ryland's note without frightening her? "You're back early," she called, noticing him. Her smile faltered as she took in his expression. "What's wrong?" Thomas dismounted, leading Scout to the hitching post. "I found a note from Ryland. He wants to meet me in town tomorrow." Rebecca's hands stilled on the sheet she was hanging. "Did he say why?" Thomas hesitated, then decided on honesty. "He implied he has information about you that could damage your reputation." Her face paled. "What could he possibly know?" "I don't know, but I intend to find out." Thomas moved closer, lowering his voice despite the fact that they were alone. "Rebecca, is there anything in your past that someone might use against you? Anything at all?" She looked away, her fingers nervously smoothing the damp sheet. "I told you my father died, and we lost our farm. Is that the whole story?" A long silence stretched between them, broken only by the gentle flapping of laundry in the breeze. Finally, Rebecca met his gaze, her eyes filled with apprehension. "Not entirely," she admitted. "My father, after my mother died, he changed. Began drinking heavily. The farm started failing because he couldn't keep up with the work." Thomas waited, sensing there was more. "He borrowed money from a man in town, Mr. Jennings. When he couldn't repay it, Mr. Jennings suggested an alternative arrangement." Rebecca's voice grew softer. "He had a son, Albert. Said if I married Albert, he'd forgive the debt." Thomas felt his stomach tighten. And this Albert was cruel. Everyone knew it. Rebecca's hands trembled slightly. "He'd had 2 wives before. Both died under suspicious circumstances. But my father was desperate. He agreed to the match without consulting me." "So you ran?" Thomas guessed. Rebecca nodded. "I took what little money we had left and answered an advertisement for mail-order brides. I specified the farthest possible destination." A rueful smile touched her lips. "Montana seemed sufficiently distant. But you didn't choose me specifically?" "No. The agency matched us based on my preferences. I wanted someone younger, with land, who lived remotely." She looked up at him. "I never expected." "What?" Thomas prompted gently when she didn't continue. "To find someone like you," she finished. "Someone kind and honorable. Someone I could." She stopped, color rising in her cheeks. Thomas took her hand, his calloused fingers entwining with hers. "Could what, Rebecca?" "Someone I could care for," she whispered. The admission hung in the air between them, fragile and precious. Thomas wanted nothing more than to pull her into his arms, to tell her that he cared for her too, more deeply than he'd thought possible after knowing her such a short time. Instead, he squeezed her hand. "Thank you for telling me the truth. I don't see how Ryland could know any of this, but I'll be prepared for whatever he has to say tomorrow." "Let me come with you," Rebecca urged. "This concerns me as much as you." Thomas shook his head. His note specifically said to come alone. "I don't trust him, Rebecca. I'd rather you stay here where it's safe." Though she clearly wanted to argue, Rebecca eventually agreed. That night, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, an unspoken tension hovered between them. The kiss they'd shared after the dance remained unacknowledged, yet Thomas felt its presence in every glance, every accidental touch. The next morning, Thomas dressed with care before riding to town. Whatever Ryland had planned, he wanted to face it with dignity. Rebecca stood on the porch as he mounted Scout, her expression a mixture of worry and something deeper, something that made his heart race. "Be careful," she said simply. Thomas nodded. "I'll be back before supper." The Clearwater Saloon was relatively quiet at midday, with only a few patrons nursing drinks at scattered tables. Victor Ryland sat in the back corner, a glass of whiskey in front of him, watching the door with a satisfied smile as Thomas entered. "Right on time," Ryland said, gesturing to the chair across from him. "I appreciate punctuality." Thomas remained standing. "Say what you have to say, Ryland. I'm not here for pleasantries." Ryland chuckled. "So direct." "Very well." He slid an envelope across the table. "Take a look." Thomas opened it cautiously, pulling out several papers. The first was a certificate from the Western Brides Agency confirming the arrangement of a marriage between Thomas Yates of Raven Creek Ranch and Rebecca Kincaid of Lancaster, Pennsylvania. The second was a letter in what appeared to be Rebecca's handwriting, detailing her preferences for a husband. "Where did you get these?" Thomas demanded. Ryland sipped his whiskey. "I have connections back east. When I heard about your mysterious housekeeper, I made inquiries." "Why?" Thomas asked, though he already suspected the answer. "Because, my young friend, information is power." Ryland leaned forward. "Did you know your housekeeper is actually running from a legal betrothal in Pennsylvania? That her father promised her to another man?" Thomas kept his expression neutral. "What's your point, Ryland?" "My point is that the entire town believes you're living in sin with this woman. A woman who abandoned one commitment and is clearly making another with you, without the benefit of marriage." Ryland's smile turned predatory. "Imagine how Sheriff Davis would react to learning Miss Kincaid is essentially a fugitive. Or how the good ladies of Clearwater Springs would treat her knowing she's sharing more than just your home." "We're not," Thomas began, but Ryland held up a hand. "It doesn't matter what the truth is. It's what people believe." He tapped the papers. "I have proof she came here as your bride. Your continued insistence that she's merely your housekeeper only makes the situation more scandalous." Thomas's hands clenched at his sides. "What do you want, Ryland?" "The same thing I've always wanted. Your land." Ryland sat back, supremely confident. "Sell me Raven Creek Ranch for a fair price, and these papers disappear. Miss Kincaid's reputation remains intact. You can both start fresh elsewhere, perhaps even as a proper married couple if that's your inclination." "And if I refuse?" "Then by this time tomorrow, everyone from here to Helena will know that Thomas Yates, the orphan boy who built himself a cattle empire, is keeping a runaway bride as his mistress." Ryland's eyes hardened. "Your business partners might reconsider their arrangements with a man of such questionable character. And Miss Kincaid? Well, small towns can be terribly unforgiving to women with tarnished reputations." Thomas stared at the man across from him, hatred burning in his chest. "You orchestrated this whole thing, didn't you? You're the one who contacted the bride agency." Ryland spread his hands. "I simply created an opportunity. I never expected you to develop genuine feelings for the girl. That was an unexpected bonus. You're despicable. I'm a businessman, Thomas. One who's waited very patiently for you to be reasonable about that land." Ryland slid a document across the table. "A sale contract. The price is generous. Sign it, and by this time tomorrow, your problems disappear along with these incriminating papers." Thomas picked up the contract, scanning the terms. The price was indeed fair, more than fair. With this money, he and Rebecca could start over anywhere they chose. They could marry, build a new life, far from Ryland's influence. But Raven Creek wasn't just land to Thomas. It was 15 years of backbreaking work. It was the last connection to his parents and uncle. It was the only home he'd ever known. And now, it was the place where he'd found Rebecca. Without a word, Thomas tore the contract in half, then quarters, then eighths, dropping the pieces onto Ryland's whiskey. "Keep your money," he said quietly, "and do your worst. Rebecca and I have nothing to hide." Ryland's face darkened. "You're making a mistake, boy." "No," Thomas said, turning to leave. "For the first time in years, I'm certain I'm doing exactly the right thing." As he mounted Scout for the ride home, Thomas's mind raced. He'd just defied the most powerful man in the county, a man who had shown he was willing to go to extraordinary lengths to get what he wanted. There would be consequences, not just for him, but for Rebecca as well. He urged Scout into a gallop, suddenly desperate to reach home, to reach her, before Ryland could set his revenge in motion. When the ranch came into view, Thomas felt a momentary relief at the sight of smoke rising from the chimney. But as he drew closer, he noticed something wrong. The front door stood open, swinging slightly in the breeze. "Rebecca," he called, dismounting before Scout had fully stopped. The house was eerily quiet. In the kitchen, a pot of stew simmered on the stove, but Rebecca was nowhere to be seen. A chair lay overturned near the table, and a dish towel had fallen to the floor. Fear gripped Thomas as he searched the house, calling Rebecca's name with increasing urgency. When he found no sign of her inside, he rushed to the barn, then the garden, his heart pounding painfully in his chest. It was there, among the neat rows of vegetables Rebecca had so lovingly tended, that he found her bonnet, trampled into the dirt. And beside it, a note. She's safe. For now. Come to Bridgewater Ranch. Alone. VR. Thomas stared at the note, cold fury replacing his fear. Ryland had taken Rebecca, had dared to enter his home and abduct her while he was in town. The man's arrogance was staggering, his tactics despicable. But Thomas wasn't the 9-year-old boy who'd found his uncle dead, helpless and alone. He was a man who had built a life through determination and grit, who had faced down blizzards and drought and predators. A man who had, against all odds, found something worth fighting for. Someone worth fighting for. He strode to the house, retrieved his rifle, and checked it carefully. Then he saddled Scout, patting the horse's neck reassuringly before mounting. Let's bring her home, boy, he murmured, turning toward Bridgewater Ranch. The ride seemed interminable, each mile increasing Thomas's resolve. Whatever game Ryland thought he was playing had just changed. Thomas had spent 15 years building a life of quiet solitude, asking nothing of anyone. But now, with Rebecca in danger, he discovered a fierce protectiveness he hadn't known he possessed. Bridgewater Ranch sprawled across a valley, its buildings more numerous and ornate than Thomas's modest setup. As he approached, 2 ranch hands appeared, rifles at the ready. "Mr. Ryland's expecting you," one said, gesturing for Thomas to follow. They led him to the main house, a 2-story structure with a wide veranda and elaborate woodwork. Inside, the furnishings spoke of wealth and Eastern tastes, heavy drapes, plush carpets, and furniture too delicate for a working ranch. Ryland sat behind a desk in what appeared to be a study, looking for all the world like a king holding court. He smiled as Thomas entered, gesturing dismissively for his men to leave. "Thomas, that was quick. I wasn't expecting you for at least another hour." "Where is she?" Thomas demanded, his voice deadly quiet. Ryland leaned back in his chair. "Safe and comfortable, I assure you. My housekeeper is seeing to her needs. I want to see her. Now. All in good time." Ryland opened a drawer and removed the contract Thomas had torn up earlier. "I took the liberty of preparing a fresh copy. Once you sign, Miss Kincaid will be free to leave with you." Thomas's hand tightened on his rifle. "And if I refuse? Then things become complicated." Ryland's smile vanished. "I've sent a telegram to Pennsylvania, to a Mr. Albert Jennings. It seems he's been searching for his runaway fiancée for some time. He was quite interested to learn of her whereabouts." The name sent a chill through Thomas. Rebecca had spoken of Albert Jennings with genuine fear. "You're bluffing." "Am I?" Ryland produced another paper, a telegram reply. "Mr. Jennings is already en route. Should arrive within the week, barring delays. I'm sure the sheriff will be interested to hear his side of the story. Abduction of a promised bride is a serious offense in some jurisdictions." Thomas took a step forward. "Rebecca came west of her own free will. She wasn't abducted. That's not how Mr. Jennings sees it. And with the documents I have showing she was expected to be your bride, not your housekeeper." Ryland shrugged. "The situation looks compromising at best, criminal at worst. This is extortion. This is business, Thomas. Nothing personal." Ryland pushed the contract across the desk. "Sign, and all these problems disappear. You and Miss Kincaid can leave Montana together, start fresh somewhere else. I'll even throw in my best wagon and team to help you on your way." Thomas looked down at the contract, the generous figures still prominently displayed. It was, objectively, a fair offer. More than fair. With that money, he could build a new ranch somewhere, perhaps in Wyoming or Colorado. He and Rebecca could marry, have the life together that was rapidly becoming his most cherished dream. But at what cost? Surrendering to a bully like Ryland meant living with the knowledge that he'd been beaten, that he'd given up his parents' legacy, his life's work, because he wasn't strong enough to find another way. "I want to see Rebecca," Thomas said again. "Then I'll consider your offer." Ryland studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Very well. Follow me." He led Thomas upstairs to a bedroom at the end of the hall. Inside, Rebecca sat in a chair by the window, her face lighting up when she saw Thomas. "Thomas, thank God you're all right." She rushed to him, and Thomas pulled her into his arms, momentarily forgetting Ryland's presence. "Are you hurt? Did they harm you?" "No," she assured him, though her voice trembled. "They surprised me in the garden. I tried to fight, but there were 2 of them." Thomas held her tighter, fury building in him at the thought of Ryland's men laying hands on her. "How touching," Ryland commented from the doorway. I'll give you a few minutes to discuss my offer, Thomas. I'm sure Miss Kincaid will help you see reason. When the door closed behind him, Rebecca pulled back to look at Thomas. What offer? What's happening? Thomas quickly explained the situation, Ryland's scheme with the bride agency, his threats regarding Albert Jennings, and his demand that Thomas sell the ranch. Rebecca's face paled. Albert is coming here? Thomas, you don't understand. He's dangerous. His previous wives, there were rumors they didn't die naturally. I won't let him near you, Thomas promised. But Ryland's offering a way out. If I sell him the ranch, he claims he'll destroy the evidence, and we can leave Montana before Jennings arrives. And you're considering it? Rebecca searched his face. It's a fair price, Thomas said, though the words tasted bitter. We could start over somewhere else. Together. Rebecca's eyes widened slightly at the implication. Together? Thomas took her hands in his. Rebecca, I know we've only known each other a short time, but these weeks with you, they've been the best of my life. The ranch has been my home for 15 years, but it never felt truly complete until you arrived. Oh, Thomas, she whispered, her eyes filling with tears. I love you, he said simply. And if selling Raven Creek is the price of keeping you safe, of having a future with you, then I'll pay it. Rebecca reached up to touch his face, her eyes shining with emotion. I love you too, more than I thought possible after so short a time. Her expression hardened with resolve. But I won't let you sacrifice your home, your legacy, because of me. There must be another way. Thomas kissed her forehead gently. I've been racking my brain, but Ryland holds all the cards. He has documents that could ruin your reputation. He's contacted Jennings, and he's clearly not above using force to get what he wants. Rebecca was silent for a moment, her brow furrowed in thought. Then she looked up, a new determination in her eyes. What if we give him what he wants, but not how he expects? What do you mean? Ryland wants your land because of the water rights, correct? When Thomas nodded, she continued. Could you sell him just the water rights? Keep the ranch, but grant him legal access to Raven Creek. Thomas considered this. It's possible. Water rights can be separated from land ownership. But would he accept that? He might, if it solves his primary problem. Rebecca squeezed his hands. And we have another card to play that he doesn't know about. What's that? A small, fierce smile curved her lips. The truth about Albert Jennings. There's a reason I ran, Thomas. I have proof that Albert was responsible for his second wife's death. Letters she wrote to my mother before she died, detailing his threats and abuse. Thomas stared at her in surprise. You have these letters? In my trunk at the ranch. I brought them as insurance, in case he ever found me. Her expression grew solemn. If Jennings comes to Montana, he'll find himself facing murder charges, not a runaway bride. For the first time since finding Rebecca's bonnet in the garden, Thomas felt a flicker of hope. That changes everything. If Jennings is the criminal, not you. Then Ryland's leverage disappears, Rebecca finished. But we need to get back to the ranch to retrieve those letters. Thomas nodded, his mind racing as a plan began to form. I think I know how to handle this. When Ryland returned to the room, his confident smile faltered slightly at the united front presented by Thomas and Rebecca, standing hand in hand. I've made my decision, Thomas announced. I won't sell you Raven Creek Ranch. Ryland's face darkened. Then you leave me no choice but to. I haven't finished, Thomas interrupted. I won't sell you the ranch, but I am willing to negotiate water rights. Legal access to Raven Creek for your cattle, in perpetuity, with reasonable limitations to protect the watershed. This unexpected proposal gave Ryland pause. Water rights alone? That's not what I proposed. It's what you need, Thomas countered. Your cattle suffer in dry years because your streams run low. Raven Creek never does. This solves your problem without requiring me to give up my home. And what about Miss Kincaid's situation? Albert Jennings will still arrive within the week. Rebecca stepped forward. Let him come. I have evidence proving Mr. Jennings murdered his previous wife. Evidence I'll be happy to share with Sheriff Davis and the territorial authorities. Uncertainty flickered in Ryland's eyes. You're bluffing. Am I? Rebecca's voice was steady. Would you stake your reputation on that? Because when Albert Jennings is arrested for murder, people will ask how he knew where to find me. Your involvement will become public knowledge. The three of them stood in silence, the balance of power shifting perceptibly. Finally, Ryland laughed, a short, surprised sound. Well played, both of you. He looked at Thomas with newfound respect. Water rights, you say? With what limitations? We can discuss the details with lawyers present, Thomas said firmly. And all your evidence regarding Rebecca, the agency documents, the telegrams to Jennings, will be turned over to us. And if I refuse? Thomas met his gaze steadily. Then we'll take our chances with the law. Sheriff Davis is a fair man. I think he'll be interested to hear how you arranged a false mail-order bride scenario and then abducted a woman from private property to force a land sale. It was a gamble, but Thomas could see from Ryland's expression that it was working. The man hadn't built his empire by taking foolish risks, and the potential scandal of such allegations would undermine his standing in the community far more than failing to acquire Raven Creek. Very well, Ryland conceded. Water rights, with reasonable limitations. And this unpleasantness remains between us. Agreed, Thomas said. We'll draw up the papers tomorrow. For now, Rebecca and I are leaving. Ryland nodded, stepping aside to let them pass. At the door, he called after them. You're a surprising man, Thomas Yates. Perhaps I've underestimated you all these years. Thomas didn't reply, keeping a protective arm around Rebecca as they descended the stairs and exited the house. Only when they were mounted on Scout, Rebecca seated securely in front of him, did he allow himself to breathe freely. Are you really all right? He asked softly as they rode toward home. Rebecca leaned back against his chest. I am now, though I was terrified when they took me, not for myself, but for you. I was afraid of what Ryland might do. I was worried about you too. Thomas tightened his arm around her waist. When I found your bonnet in the garden. I dropped it deliberately, she admitted. I hoped you'd understand something was wrong. Thomas pressed a kiss to her hair. You're remarkable, you know that? Most people would have been paralyzed with fear, but you were thinking ahead, planning. I've had to be resourceful before, she said simply. When you grow up with a father like mine, you learn to think quickly. As Raven Creek Ranch came into view, bathed in the golden light of late afternoon, Thomas felt a profound sense of gratitude. Not just for keeping his land, but for the woman in his arms who had fought alongside him, who had shown as much determination to protect his home as he had to protect her. It's beautiful, Rebecca murmured, gazing at the ranch. Even more beautiful now that I thought we might lose it. Thomas slowed Scout to a walk, wanting to prolong this moment of homecoming. It is beautiful, but it was just land and buildings before you came. You've made it a home again, Rebecca. She turned slightly to look up at him. What happens now? After we finalize the water rights agreement with Ryland. Thomas guided Scout to a stop near the house. That depends on you. On me. He dismounted, then reached up to help her down, keeping his hands at her waist even after her feet touched the ground. Rebecca Kincaid, he said solemnly. You may have arrived here by mistake, but I can't imagine my life without you now. I know it's only been a few weeks, but I love you. I want to build a life with you, if you'll have me. Tears welled in Rebecca's amber eyes. Are you asking what I think you're asking? Thomas smiled. I believe I am. Though I don't have a ring yet, and this isn't the romantic proposal you deserve. It's perfect, she whispered, reaching up to touch his face. And yes, Thomas Yates. Yes, I'll marry you. He kissed her then, there in the yard of Raven Creek Ranch, with the Montana sunset painting the sky in brilliant hues around them. It was a kiss full of promise, of a future neither had dared to imagine before fate, or Victor Ryland's scheming, brought them together. When they finally parted, Rebecca laughed softly. What will the town say? The reclusive rancher who hadn't touched a woman in 15 years, marrying his mail-order bride after just a month. Let them talk, Thomas said, taking her hand as they walked toward the house, their home. We know the truth. And the truth is, sometimes mistakes turn out to be the best thing that could happen to a person. Rebecca smiled up at him. The very best thing. 1 year later, Thomas stood on the porch of Raven Creek Ranch, watching as Rebecca hung laundry in the yard, her movements careful due to her advancing pregnancy. The morning sun caught in her auburn hair, now styled in a practical braid down her back, and glinted off the gold band on her left hand. The water rights agreement with Victor Ryland had been finalized without incident, the man seemingly content with his partial victory. Albert Jennings had indeed arrived in Montana, only to find himself facing a territorial marshal with questions about his previous wives. He'd left in custody, Rebecca's letters providing enough evidence to warrant a formal investigation in Pennsylvania. As for Thomas and Rebecca, They had married in a small ceremony at the ranch 3 months after her arrival, with Mrs. Bennett organizing a celebration that brought the entire town to Raven Creek. Sheriff Davis had given the bride away, remarking that he'd never seen two people more perfectly matched despite their unusual beginning. Life had settled into a rhythm that still amazed Thomas daily. Waking beside Rebecca, working the ranch knowing she waited at home, sharing meals and conversation and quiet evenings on the porch. The solitude he'd known for 15 years had given way to partnership, to a love that deepened with each passing day. "What are you thinking about?" Rebecca called, noticing him watching her. "How lucky I am," he answered honestly. She smiled, resting a hand on her rounded belly. "We're both lucky. Though I still can't believe how it all began, with a mail-order bride arriving by mistake." Thomas crossed the yard to join her, taking the basket of wet laundry from her hands and setting it aside. "The best mistake of my life," he said, drawing her into his arms. As they stood together in the morning sunlight, the ranch thriving around them and their first child growing beneath Rebecca's heart, Thomas knew with absolute certainty that his 15 years of solitude had been worth the wait. For they had prepared him to recognize true happiness when it arrived on his doorstep, in the form of a young woman with auburn hair and amber eyes, brought to him by a scheme that had backfired in the most wonderful way possible. The lonely rancher wasn't lonely anymore, and he never would be again.